Hello, welcome to the France 24 interview. Well, it's been a little over a month since a fragile truce was declared in Yemen's vital port city of Hodeidah. And in that month, you might want to ask whether or not there's any end in sight to what's been called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Hodeidah, of course, is the city through which about 3/4 of all the vital food and fuel and aid supplies to Yemen's very hard-hit civilian population was channeled. And joining me today, actually, is the executive director of one of the aid organizations that has been active on the ground there, trying to provide relief to those civilians. Véronique Andrieux is executive director of Action Against Hunger. And more importantly, for our purposes today, you are just back from a visit to Yemen. You traveled around northern cities, but for our purposes, aside from Sana'a and Hajjah, you were in Hodeidah, that port city I was just talking about. Just tell us, what is the situation there right now on the ground, 1 month after this ceasefire?
So thank you, Douglas, for inviting me here. So the truce started on December 18th. What we saw there is essentially a reduced level of conflict. There's still clashes at night, some even heavy clashes. But still, I mean, we hope that the ceasefire will hold.
When you say heavy clashes, artillery fire, mortar shells, not airstrikes?
Not airstrikes, but artillery and gunshots.
Do civilians, because these are the people you're trying to help, did you get the sense, did you see life on the streets? Are civilians working? Are markets open? Are people walking about?
So since the truce started, some civilians have gone back to the city. Maybe it's worth noting that 2/3 of the population of the whole governorate of Hodeidah were displaced due to the threats, to the conflict. Some of them are starting to come back. Some shops were open. Some schools were open as well. There was some kind of, markets were also functioning, some of them. But half of the city is actually completely cut. You would see these huge containers, like the typical Maersk containers, all graffitied with slogans and messages, about the war and the hope for peace for the Yemeni people, for a better future. There was also in the streets a number of big piles of sand and rocks to prevent movement across the city.
That's exactly it. Lots of obstacles, lots of roadblocks.
Lots, and increasingly so, of course, as you get closer to the port, and a number of checkpoints also to get into the city, very, very important, both if you want to go down south or into the north to Hajjah, a lot of checkpoints.
So clearly still a very tense situation, uncertain situation. We've talked about this crisis. We've talked about how there are some 20 million hungry people, 3/4 of the population. Some are actually on the brink of famine, children particularly hard hit. You say markets were open. Presumably there's food. Can anyone afford the food? Are people eating? Are they able to get nutritious food?
Okay. I want to note that the situation... Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East and was already the poorest country in the Middle East before this conflict. The levels of poverty were alarming, including malnutrition levels before the conflict. However, the conflict has deeply aggravated this situation, and the percentage of people falling through the cracks in terms of food security is increasing. So if we take, for instance, the IPC, so the Integrated Food Security Phase classification, we see that there is
That's
at
a
least
5-point classification,
exactly.
If I understand.
Absolutely. If you take IPC 4, that's the emergency threshold. If you take IPC 5, it's catastrophe.
Right.
Okay.
And I think 250,000 people are in the worst, the most severe catastrophic category.
You're right. That's IPC 5. Indeed. Yes, it's 1% of the population of Yemen in that situation across about 100 districts out of the 330 districts in Yemen.
How do you get food to these? How had you been getting food to people, and how Is it easier right now to get food to them? And are you actually able to do so? Are you able to do your job?
Well, there's, two important elements maybe to flag here. First of all is the economic situation in Yemen that needs to be part of the solution, beyond, of course, a negotiated political peace agreement. But the root causes are very important, and the economic component of the solution is also very, very important. To give you some elements, for 2.5 years, civil servants have not been paid. This means they get no salaries. Right now, the humanitarian community is playing a role of a safety net, paying some incentives to health workers, for instance. The second element is that there is a collapse of the Yemen rial, the Yemeni currency. Which means that taking into consideration that 90% of the food that is in Yemen, that is food imports are 90% in Yemen. This means that the basic food basket is extremely expensive. The cost has tripled since the beginning of the conflict. This is also compounded by the blockade. Which means, for instance, if you take Hodeidah port, that's 75% of the imports in Yemen, both fuel, food, humanitarian supplies. 3 out of the 5 cranes there have been brought down and are laying down on the port. Only 2 are standing.
So the infrastructure has been
severely
really
damaged completely, and there is also let's say, Saudi controls also on the waters, and screening whatever comes through the port. So in terms of, let's say, the access to food, it's really, really complex.
Very complex. I just want to jump in because you were mentioning some of that infrastructure. Hospitals were hit during the war. Saudi-led airstrikes hit hospitals, schools, even wedding parties. Are there functioning hospitals? Where do people go if they're sick? Are there any health services right now available to the population?
Our estimates is that 50% of life-saving basic social services infrastructure are disrupted and not functioning any longer. And those that are still in place can only provide very, very basic services.
Very basic services.
Very basic.
Clean water, access to clean water, absolutely vital. Millions did not have access to clean water. Cholera was a waterborne disease, and we talked a lot about that. Are there still threats of cholera outbreaks? Has that been solved, or is it being addressed?
So there's been a few waves of cholera. The cholera has been is right now under control. We have to bear in mind that you were mentioning almost 10 million people in severe food security situation. There is also 14 million people in acute need in terms of health.
14 million.
14 million.
Okay.
And 13 million in terms of acute needs of water and sanitation.
That's out of a total population of 28 million?
29.
29, so about half the population, a little more, acute needs.
Acute needs, yes. And I would like also to highlight the protection, including gender-based violence needs that are acute needs for 8 million people. You were asking me about the difficulties we face to do our work. Well, beyond that, let's say, situation that I just described, there is a huge issue of humanitarian access, also security constraints, administrative hurdles, and the north-south divide of the country.
Which has always remained a dire divide. In the little time we have left, I want to ask you, what can people who are watching this right now, this interview, what could they do to help? What are the things you most need on the ground for your workers?
What we need, what we really hope for Yemen, for the people of Yemen, is that this ceasefire will hold and that all parties, including the Emiratis, will stick to the terms of the agreement and will make peace last. We need this humanitarian access. This is an indispensable condition.
Which you still don't have. You're still restricted a lot in your movements.
Very much. Just to give you an example, whenever we ask for travel authorizations, it takes 5 days to get. And in some cases, quite often we just don't get that travel authorization. That also includes our national staff, and in particular female staff. So that's very complicated, and in some cases that leads to a lack of closeness to our programs and the need to operate with remote management.
Very difficult.
Very difficult situation.
You said you have 300 people, a team of 300 in the country. Very briefly, we don't have much time left. You recently, you and other organizations published a letter you sent to French parliamentary deputies. You're calling for pressure to be brought on the French government to reconsider its export of arms to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Any hope that that's working? Any response?
We hope that the French government will listen this time. Civil society organizations, NGOs, human rights organizations have been, at different moments, have been very vocal about this. Now there is some, let's say, tiny hope with the Senate recent decision alongside the Stockholm agreement in December. There is an arms trade treaty that France has signed and ratified, and we are only asking that, as there is enough room for doubt that some of these arms might be used by the Emiratis, by the Saudis during this conflict that is extremely costly in human lives, in terms of the protection of civilians, in terms of violations of human rights and violation of international humanitarian law. We are asking the French government to reconsider and to stop and seize all sorts of arms trade to the countries who are party to conflict.
Party to the conflict. Véronique Andrieux.
Actually, that could lead to complicity in terms of war crimes if
absolutely, and France isn't the only one. The UK and the US are also big arms sellers to that region.
Indeed, France is not the only one.
We're unfortunately out of time. Your mission is just beginning in this post-conflict phase, but we wish you lots of luck, obviously a daunting challenge ahead. And we thank all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.
Because a new page of history gets written every day. Because breaking news can't wait. Information everywhere. In all situations. On every subject. Understanding the world. Imagining the world. France 24. A different take on the news.